Good morning. Have you ever played the game? And I guess to call it a game is a bit of a stretch, but it's a conversation game that I've played with my friends about the thing that you would grab first if you had to leave your house in case of an emergency. So the answer obviously can't be like your family and your pets. Like this is like the really kind of like maybe superficial, but something that's probably meaningful to you, that's like that one thing that you're like, this will make my next house a home, or this is the one thing that I really want to kind of hold on to. You ever like thought of that? Yeah? T, what would you bring?
Safe.
You're safe? I'm not even going to ask what's in it. Anyone else? Have you ever thought of that? Like, what's that? Danielle, what's up?
My bear.
Your bear? Yeah. For sure, I have a lion named Randy that I would like hate to leave behind. Anyone? Musicians? Anyone? It's one of those things that you kind of like you think about, but you don't want to think about. But it's the thing that you kind of what transfixes, what transforms your next dwelling place, your next space from just a place where you are to a place where you feel at home. Do you got another one? Yeah. Your grandma's jewelry box, exactly. Yeah. So for years, my answer was always this painting that I have in my house, which is the first thing that I ever hung in my very first home that was mine. So not my family's home, but just like my own dwelling place, right? And it's just a woman. She got a crow on her head. It's pretty. It's watercolor and ink, and it's just a picture, but it's been the thing that I've placed in all the places that I have moved. It's the first thing I put on my wall. And it just it moves with me, and it makes me remember that a place is just a place, but it's the people and the work that we do together that kind of make it a home. And it's just a picture. It's nothing special. But it has turned my house, especially here in New York when I moved by myself, into a place that I recognize as home for me. And this passage of Scripture this morning that we read together, it's often referred to as the Transfiguration. Something happens that makes Jesus not just Jesus, but divine. It's a time that Jesus himself, his body, not just his message or his work, is the source of amazement in which we see Jesus transform again from human to God. That's the Transfiguration. Which is much easier, I think, for us to understand today. We as modern readers and hearers have multiple understandings and accounts of Jesus' life under our belt. We have Nicene councils that have affirmed who Jesus is and was to us. We have the Gospel of John, who literally is like, Jesus is the Word in the very beginning of everything. We get to know and proclaim Jesus as personal for us. The relationship that we're building is personal and sometimes even a little magical. But for the early hearers of this message, for people like John and James and Peter, it wouldn't have been as easy. You see, they were looking for the, quote, anointed one, as prophesied in Isaiah. The one who would bring justice and peace to Israel and all of her people. And they had been with Jesus for a while. And while they were into what he was doing and what he was teaching and saying, the God of their scriptures, the God of the Hebrew Bible, hadn't been as explicit as they wanted. This is it. They needed the assurance that someone would bring their past and their present and their future all together. But Jesus has a plan. So I imagine it goes something sort of like this. Jesus is up to his eyes in people all the time. He loves it, but it can also be a lot, I'm sure. I don't know if you've met people, but people are the very best and the very worst all the time. So Jesus is with people, his people, and he says, hey, you, James, Peter, John, let's take a stroll up this mountain. Let me lead you. And I imagine them looking around at each other and saying, me? Like, is anyone else come? Just the three of us. Just, you named us? Yeah? Okay. There's a little nervousness there. And I don't blame them. Because in our scripture today, the Greek verb used for led, as in he led them up a mountain, is the word anaphoro. And the disciples, they know the word anaphoro means to lead, but they also know that it can mean something else, as words often do. Anaphoro is a word also used for sacrifice in the story of Abraham and Isaac, as we see in the Septuagint, which is it's a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. It's a very early translation, but it's so that those that spoke and read Greek could also read the Hebrew scriptures. So the disciples here, let me lead you up this mountain, and rightfully probably get a little bit nervous. They hear anaphoro. So it's lead, but it's also sacrifice. Which one are they? They get nervous and they look around. He's going to lead us, but they think maybe, is this our last go? So I get it. I get that they may have been a bit hesitant to wander up a mountain by themselves, anaphoro, with Jesus. Again, we as modern hearers know better. But that would not have been the case for these early communities that came in contact with Jesus. So the four of them, three of whom are probably a bit nervous, head on up this mountain. And once they are up this mountain, I imagine Jesus takes a deep breath. That type of deep breath that you take in before starting those conversations that we keep putting off. That really deep breath that sits in the gut of your belly. That deep breath before you belt out a beautiful tune. But that deep breath that kind of is like, oh, what comes next? And right before his exhale, as he has taken a breath so deep that he is about to share words with these people so pure, his breath and his heart and his blood stop. Because suddenly he is pure light. He is pure shine. He is pure God. Jesus is transformed into something that can only be divine. He is shining and dazzling, as bright as the sun, and time for all of them stands still. I wonder how long they actually looked at him as he shone. Did it assuage any anxiety or spin it into overdrive? Did they humble themselves at the sight of that? Did one bow their head at the sight of it and then look away only to notice the other two still staring? Were mouths agape? Were there tears? Did John give a quick elbow to James as siblings do to make sure he showed the proper respect? And I'm sure they had questions. I have questions. It's overwhelming. And instead of breaking that moment, that silence, that time standing still, well, they didn't have to break it because the ancestors of their faith show up to do that for them. And it can be hard, again, to grasp because for them, or for us, it would be like Jesus showing up for us. But for them, Moses and Elijah showing up to have a moment with Jesus, that's the assurance that they need. It's the assurance that we all keep hoping for, that Jesus is going to show up right in our midst and say, this is it. This is the way. So their ancestors are here saying, you're doing the right thing. We're all here together. And in the aftermath of this divine intervention, the most relatable thing, in my opinion, happens. Peter is so blown away that he does everything in his power to hold on to this moment, which I get. I don't know if you get it, but I do. We're a culture that tries to preserve moments. It's why the main selling feature of almost every new telephone, or of every new phone, is a camera. Like, it's the first thing Apple puts out. It's like the Apple 2000. It's Great. It's got this amazing camera. Because we want to stop the very best of time and hold on to it for as long as we can, especially when we are in the midst of larger chaos or unequitable situations. So Peter wants to hold on to this moment, but he doesn't have a camera, so he does what he assumes is the next best thing. He offers to build them a house. It's like, here you go, let's capture this right here. He's like, hey guys, this is great. You're all here now. Let's just live here together forever. Like, this is it. I'm gonna build you houses, stay put. But trying to keep the ancestors and Jesus to stay put isn't even the most relatable part, in my opinion. The part that gets me is Peter has been with Jesus for a while. This is not like, hey, nice to meet you, we're brand new to each other. He has seen him at work. He's heard the stories. He's seen him on the road. He's traveled with him. And Peter's first thought in all of this, in trying to be helpful, I don't want to put down what he's actually trying to do. It's just overwhelming. But his first thought in seeing the ancestors and Jesus all together is to domesticize Jesus' mission for all people for the benefit of Peter's people. And I get that. He's like, I've got the goods. I've got what I've been looking for so long right here. Let's keep it. So I know how to reach it. I know where you are at all times. I can touch it. I can see it. I can feel it. I get that. I get that wanting to hold on to it. But Jesus' ministry is hard. There's no superficial comfort in the gospel. No chapter that says after performing several miracles and working his entire life, Jesus retires to Boca for thoughts and prayers for all the people. That's not really Jesus' game. No, the gospel of Jesus Christ is one of unending justice for God's people. It makes you look at your past right in the face, the past that is your reassurance that you are in the right place. And it says, keep moving forward. Go out. Go out from your homes. Don't stay put. Go into the people and seek justice. It's why the next line of scripture isn't, and then Jesus and Moses and Elijah all lived together forever in homes that Peter built. Jesus' ministry, which includes the ministry that we are each called to do with him, is meant to be wild and untamed. It is meant to keep shining. It is meant to keep us all moving. It is meant to live on elsewhere and everywhere. To blow us all away again and again. And then, for the third time in the book of Matthew, our scripture says that we hear God. Well, they are all looking away, staring anywhere but directly at the light of Jesus. They hear God say, "This is my beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Listen." So today we, as a group in our reading, ended at verse 5, but the paragraph, which in their Bible is called a pericope, the end of the pericope usually ends at verse 9. So I want you to know how the rest of this story ends, because we're going to come back to this moment of all of them hearing God's voice. But how the story ends is God says, listen, and John and Peter and James are all rightfully terrified, and they're on the ground, and Jesus comes up to them, and now Jesus is alone. Moses and Elijah have gone, and he touches them and says, "Do not be afraid." And I guess they aren't, because the next line is literally, they head back down the mountain. And Jesus says, don't tell anybody. So, that's how the end of that story works. And we know that they keep their promise. Jesus says, don't tell anybody until after I've come back from the dead. We all know these stories, and we know they may or may not be great at keeping secrets. But they are back, and we know it, and we have this knowledge of what is actually happening. But they've gone, and they go back down the mountain, as Scripture says. So that's the rest of the story. But I want to go back to the moment in which God speaks, okay? So everyone's kind of prostrate, and they're on the ground, because God, they've seen Elijah, they've seen the ancestors Jesus is shining. God comes down. This is my beloved. They're like, what is happening? Their heads are down. And I want to know what they're thinking, because as their heads are down, if you look down so intently because you can't look right in front of you, and God cuts you off because Peter was speaking, who do you think God is talking about? If you see three people, and then you look down, and a fourth voice comes from afar and says, "This is my beloved," who do you think that God's talking about? If you're Peter, do you think it's you? Because you're the last one that spoke, and you just said, hey, I'm going to build them these houses. Like, it's out of the goodness of your heart. You think that that's what's happening. But also, are you a little bit terrified? Because the thought of being God's chosen one is a little overwhelming. And what about John and James? Do they think maybe the beloved one is Moses and Elijah? After all, God didn't talk to them in this way and say, this is my beloved, when it was just Jesus. It takes a little bit of faith. I imagine all of them looking down, probably for a really prolonged moment of time, because I would not want to be the first one to look up. But then one of them does, they look up. And because Jesus is near, they all start to look up. And that one act of looking up, staring Jesus in the face, has changed their whole life. They know, they have the assurance of their ancestors that Jesus is the one. And it happens because, again, they look up. We are a society that has yet to look up. God calls people to journey up the mountain with us. We are shown God at work, and yet we often look away. We look down rather than in the eyes of the woman experiencing homelessness. We look away or turn the channel when faced with a story that challenges our own privilege within the systems of, let's say, sexism or racism or homophobia. We close our eyes and offer thoughts and prayers rather than offering our time and our presence. But what would happen if we stopped living in this moment of fear and looked up? Looked at God in the face and said, I am here. Use me. What would our world look like if we looked up and then nudged our neighbor to do the same? What would our world look like if everyone looked up and no matter what they saw, they could name it as God? What do you need to do? What do I need to do? What does this church need to do to make that world a reality? Luckily, the last directive of our scripture this morning gives us that hint. Listen. Listen to God. Listen to God speaking directly. Listen to every story shared like God is speaking directly to you. The disciples, they didn't look up until after God said, listen. So until they look up, they don't know who or what they have to listen to. So they hear and they take in everything that is in God's creation. And that is the type of listening that God calls us to do. To listen to one another's stories as if God is telling it directly to you. Listen to a baby cry as if it is your own child and act accordingly. Listen to the experiences of Black and brown people, of trans or gender expansive people. Don't just hear it, but wholly listen so that when you look up and you and your people see God, you can get to work. So, I've been thinking a lot about this, besides taking that little one, who's mine, I'll claim her. What What's really that one thing that I would take from my house and grab? My dwelling place. What's that thing that I would take? And I think it would be my family Bible. It's beautiful and it's gold-plated. I've brought it here before. It's about this big, this thick. It's like, and it's really pretty to look at, but it's much more than that. Because in the back, there are these pictures of people from my family throughout history. And in it, there is a listing of, do you want to come here? Okay. We've been talking about anti-preaching, so hi, baby. But so in the back of it, and again, this is kind of the perfect example because one day, should she get married or have babies or be baptized, all that goes in this family Bible. It's a place in which my ancestors have shown up. And when I read these pages, it's Jesus saying, I am here, I am with you. It's calling me into the world to do the work. And sure, it helps make my house a home, but it also reminds me that Jesus calls us out of our comfort spaces and into the world. So I would take my Bible not for the comfort that it brings, but for the nudge that it continues to bring to me and to give me. A nudge to live and love God's people wild and untamed, in and outside of my home and my church. And that I get to do this work with my own Peters and James and Johns, my biological and my faith siblings in this world. And it reminds me that I am called to do this work of ministry and life with them, with each of you. People that I am traveling the mountains and the valleys with. The ones that remind me to humble myself before God, but who also remind me to listen, who nudge me to look up. And then together we keep going. I hope you can all name the Johns and the James and the Peters of your life. And hopefully that this church is one of them, or becoming one of them. And if not, here is your nudge. Friends, listen. Listen for God. Look up and see God in every person and everything that you are doing. And then let's get going, because we have a lot of work to do. Amen.